Mike. Thanks, Kerry. Wow, well, that was a wonderful survey, I think, through 3 presentations. Before we move into the discussions, just a couple of takeaways that I was jotting down is, really starting with Sarah and talking about this responsibility in a relationship and the behavior, and I think I'd really like to explore that further. Tanya's presentation gave me an opportunity to look at international shows that include Caribbean art in a very different sense, in a critical sense, which I think is sometimes missing from these kind of grand survey shows of Caribbean art. And of course, Christopher touched on multiple models, and I think many of those models are experimental. They sometimes stand alone and have a life on their own, but then often lead into these performances. And you referenced En Masse and mentioned that it was here, so ending up in the institution, and how valuable those synergies and those conversations between spaces is. Should we kick off with this idea, I think, of visibility, Chris? I know you just ended on that, and I think it was really enlightening to talk about seeing your work in a different context outside, interpreted by Tanya. And this conversation that we have inside and outside, and how the need to be visible sometimes maybe overrides our own sense of our work, both as a curator and artist. Do you want to speak to that, Sarah?
Yeah, you can keep that.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm going to refer to an anecdote. I don't usually, I'm not gonna give names, okay? But I'm going to refer to an anecdote of a very important curator that once I was talking to him, and I say, actually the first question was, what is Caribbean art? And I felt like a school child asking you, like, talk about the universe. So, and I asked him, I said, well, we need more to have the education system more focused on the arts, and we need visibility. And he answered, cheeky, he answered in this way. He said, Sarah, you're not Cuba, you're not Haiti, you're not even Puerto Rico. Dominican Republic has no issues. And that statement, followed by a very sarcastic laugh, made me realize what the expectations were on the curatorial and on the production of contemporary art. Yes, we need visibility, but we need to have it in our own terms. I'm sure about that, and that's why we created this Curando Caribe and many other initiatives, because I thought we were not going anywhere without the education and the filling the voids or the gaps, as Annalie puts it very clearly, on the curatorial as a methodology, as a way of acting, as a way of confronting reality, the context. Yesterday, Angie was talking about the possibility of being included in these great shows and being in Venice. Do we need that, actually? Do we need that kind of visibility? Do we need to spend like $7 million like to be present for 6 months in a place that maybe nobody's going to see us, like you said, or nobody's going to care that we are there? So the trick with visibility is it's like a knife that cuts both ways, because it's, yes, you want to be there, but you don't want to actually endure what comes with it. It's a higher price to pay for that. So I believe that we need to confront this kind of situations in our own term. I think interinstitutional talks and dialogues and exchanges are perfect for this. The fact that you had The fact that you have almas here, that we could have it in the Dominican Republic, and we need that visibility within ourselves. Because if we don't see each other, what can we do, actually? And that's why these kind of platforms are so significant, because we speak the same language. We actually, and it's not getify, it's not to get in the Caribbean ghetto, because there's not such thing as Caribbean ghetto. I'm sure we are so diverse. It's just to be able to compromise with the idea of having visibility within our own boundaries, if there's such thing as boundaries here, and to be able to talk the same language. And I'm not talking about English, French, papiamento, or anything. I'm just talking this language, the cultural language. This is the only way we can pass those contingencies with. That is the only way we can actually survive. Have you noticed, O'Neill was telling me yesterday, and I'm sorry I'm taking too long, but O'Neill was telling me yesterday, Sarah, you have such drama traveling, always. It's always, because for me to get to Barbados, last time it was 24 hours of traveling. For me to get here was also 24 hours. And this is not a luck thing. This is all built. I'm sorry for the conspiracy theory, but it's like that. This is all built and constructed for us not to have this kind of a dialogue. And I'm not trying to be Denzel Washington or anything like that. It's not that I'm the bone collector, but this is a strategy. Imagine if it took me 1 hour and a half to get here, what we could do. This is a strategy, guys. And we don't have actually a connection in a maritime connection. We live like, I don't know, 2 hours in a boat, and we cannot do that. So we have to stop and think about this, because it will be much easier for us and much more difficult for everybody else to cross us. They have to pay a toll. Because the Caribbean, yes, the Caribbean is a huge wall, since Raquel was talking about walls yesterday.
Thank you. And I think it raises a point of many of the themes we've talked about at previous Tilting Axis are the boundaries. Yeah. And I'd like to get back to that later on in the conversation about these evolving models. We talked about digital very briefly with Chris's emailed exhibition, and look at some practical solutions to that when we get further on in the conversation. Tanya, did you want to speak to that as well? As a, I guess, curator from the outside, and maybe Chris should first mention, come back to the notions of visibility, and then we'll come back to you to talk about visibility as a curator looking within the region. How difficult that is for you. But Chris, if you were to speak to the initial concept of the notion of the context of visibility, both as artist and curator, just to continue on the conversation you started.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll just go back to, there's something kind of, when I did the wrestling project, I was thinking a lot about, this kind of, as you said, the conditions of visibility, like, there's a kind of negotiation, because shows have themes, parts of the world have expectations. So it returns to that moment of encounter, and the negotiations and the twisting and turning and so on. But there's something that comes up in that negotiation about this being some imposition on our self. As if but actually, that's exactly what's Caribbean. It's been going on from the very beginning of the inception of what we call the Caribbean, in the sense that I always like reading those old accounts of the explorer standing up next to the indigenous person, right? And the explorer says, so what's the name of this river, right? And the indigenous person says yes, because, Why should they disagree? So then you find out years later that it's called river. They never told him what the name of the river is. So the word for river, it's a funny thing that goes on in that negotiation. So it's a generic word for river. He never told you which river. And then if you look at the research of people like Erica James, there's some weird things that goes on. One of the earliest artifacts found in the Caribbean sat in, which I think is the Pegorini Zemi. It sat in Italy somewhere forever with people mistaking it for an African object because the cacique at the time was given Venetian beads and a rhinoceros horn. So he put it into his headgear because he's a man of business around the world. He's no different from the dancehall man that says, London, New York, they're like me, right? Bam. So one of the earliest objects of Caribbean, earliest artifacts, I think is 15-something, first half of the 16th century, was lost in an archive because people were mistaking it for an African thing because it had these two. So Erica talks about that, that kind of exchange that's going on all the time. So there's a kind of way in which it's not that it's not Caribbean, it's very Caribbean to make those kinds of mistakes or to have those kinds of relationships. And Caribbean people have been involved in that thing coyly, expediently, mischievously. And no one ever talks about it. And that's why I kind of used the word smart man when I was talking about Blue. I was trying to set him up. I was just talking that there is that trickster. I mean, Trinidadians are called the tricky Dadians, right? So, we know that's the Yoruba side of us, right? We kind of know. It's been going on for a very long time. So I think we shouldn't see it as a predicament or a tragedy. We should kind of see it as part of the game. Now there's an ethic that might have to come about at some point to make it more meaningful. But that doesn't mean that the game is going to end one day. The first smart man was, I don't want to call his name, but the first smart man was him. He called the place India, right? His maps had tigers and lions on it because he wanted to get more money. It's that simple, right? And that's our story. Now, and we are in the process of changing that process. In negotiation with that process. It doesn't seem to bloody well change. So that's my take.
Thank you. Negotiation is a word that keeps coming back and back and back. Absolutely. Tanya, as a curator located outside the region, but bringing this story very much into the center of Afro-modern, how easy was it to navigate? How easy was it to access? I guess, and then just coming really from a logistical standpoint, because this has been problematic, I think, for us as curators in the region, just to access the knowledge this is probably a great question for the afternoon session with the archive, but to connect to artists working within the region.
Well, super difficult, actually. I mean, the realities were I was doing that from Liverpool, actually then moved to London and finished the show from London, in fact. The way that I went about it was primarily to talk to people who had knowledge of the region, had worked within the region, talked to artists, talked to curators working here, and then to make the connections. And I was doing it with a view to thinking about how to change the institution, how to change the way that it approached collecting work, displaying work. And it was a show made for Tate Liverpool, which I don't know if you know, is in the historic dock on the front of the Mersey in Liverpool, and adjacent to the Maritime Museum of Merseyside, which houses also the Museum of International Slavery, and yet, as an institution, had never really addressed that history. So, and then the university has the Centre for the Study of International Slavery as well, so it became a partner. But to try and use the resources available to me in that place, but to make connections that seemed very obvious, to start conversations that seemed very obvious, but that had never really happened. So it was talking to people mostly, and rather than having, the huge amounts of resources to come and travel. And this visit actually really is kind of an amazing opportunity for me to think, okay, so that was one attempt. It was obviously a very wide-reaching exhibition, and it aimed to make connections to follow specific connections. One of the artists from the Caribbean that was featured was Ronald Moody. And to think about his journey from Jamaica to the UK, but also the journey of some of the objects that he made. And one of the sculptures that we had there was one of the sculptures in the show was already in Tate's collection, had been acquired not that long before. And then another of the objects, the head, the sculpture, super beautiful, from 1937, had been an object that had had its own journey, and journeys became really important in this show. That piece had been made in 1937 and sent to the USA for one of the later shows, the late shows of the Harlem Renaissance. It was a show that was happening in 1939, and it was going on tour. The tour of that show was interrupted by World War II. Ronald Moody never got, it was organised by the Harman Foundation, and the works were never returned, or some of the works were never returned. They ended up in the university in the USA, and Ronald Moody never got that work back. And it was his widow, years later, in the 90s, who went on an investigative journey to try and locate that piece, and found it in the collection of a university which didn't legitimately own it, in the United States. And they returned it to her. It then came into the show, and after the show, it was acquired by the Tate. But in the intervening years, Ronald Moody had passed away, so he never got that work back. But it had participated in this, key moment of an artist from the Caribbean being part of that scene in Harlem, this kind of early modernist scene. And then an artist who had ended up in the UK in another context. And it was this complex, different journeys and this level of complexity that I really wanted to deal with in the exhibition. So it was trying to bring to light these narratives that don't follow a formula, that don't follow and to think about a series of connections across a geography, but a sort of non-geography or a non-nationalistic geography. So connecting South America and the Caribbean and North America and Europe and Africa, and to try and use this idea of the continent in negative of the Atlantic as a way to undermine the kind of more simplistic approaches to geography. Anyway, that's not really about visibility.
No, thank you, absolutely. And you touched on this idea of the direct encounter and talking to artists and curators. And Chris, you spoke about that quite at length in your presentation, this idea both as an artist and curator, but ultimately it's about the artwork, and it's about being inspired by artwork that is being created, and then having the responsibility to then create a critical platform for that. And I know, Sarah, that's something that we spoke about before the session started, about the responsibility of the curator in the region and how that influences the exhibitions that we might develop. Would you like to speak further to that? Should we start with Chris again and give you time to write your notes? Chris, we spoke about the idea of the responsibility of the curator, because obviously that influences the type of shows that we do, but both as an independent curator like yourself, you mentioned maybe not feeling the same kind of responsibilities than the institutional curator. Maybe speak more to that for us.
Yeah, because I'm not accountable to boards and funders and demographics and constituencies, but which is another discipline. I'm not doing that. I'm not creating that dichotomy just to be. But yeah, I think there's something to be said, though. I think I mean, a lot of my gestures, I think, are sort of investigative. So they're still subject to research. I mean, it's kind of nerve-wracking for me, to have Blue and Hainu and different people here, because as an artist myself, when somebody gets excited about something that I do, then you kind of, they can run away with it, in the sense that give it a whole new meaning that you may not have intended. Now, sometimes that's productive and expansive, and then sometimes it may not be. So there's a kind of a way in which we come back to this question of negotiation. So the problem, I mean, the big problem is that at the institutional side, there's these kinds of rationalizations that the curators, I'm assuming, you're working in an institution and the institution says, this is how we understand X location. And this is the way we can sort of, the public or us understands this location. And how do we invest in, do we have anything invested in changing that? Because, there's a constituency that will come out en masse to see something if it kind of lives up to their expectations. And then if you don't give them what they want, And so, but then in a research, I think it's a very, sorry, I'm losing, I think it's a really difficult question. I just do what I want. I'm just following what I'm interested in. And when I am, I'm not saying that people can't do what they want, but there's a way when I don't get it right, people just chops. At home, if nobody shows up and nobody talks about it, then I'm like, boy, shit, I went to all that trouble for nothing. I don't even have a salary to do it, I will get a letter from the board saying, these kinds of shows are not working, but you just get sour, There's a term that my teenagers, when my kids were teenagers, they use, you get braced. I don't know if that term spread throughout the crib, but to be braced is to try something and everybody just kind of turn on you and say, so that's my only measure,
But maybe some of that experimental quality being shared with the institutions could really be exciting, I think, for transforming models in the region.
Actually, one of the things, I did a talk in San Francisco in a social practice MFA program last October, and they kind of said something to me that I hadn't really thought of, which is, particularly in the Caribbean, because I think it's happening to some degree in some institutions. I'm not fully up to date. But what they were saying is that institutions, it's a double-edged sword. An institution can save money by giving you a residency, like somewhere like Alicia had a residency, to kind of get interesting programs going. Right? That way they avoid the responsibility of paying staff on insurance. They say, okay, we have a grant, we host an institution for a while. And I think the new museum had something like that. I'm not accusing them, but I think Gabby was part of that program, right? And, so what they were discussing in the thing is that, wait, they get these kind of interesting programs, but then they have all these, there are no in-house curators, they're just hiring people. Sorry, yeah. So there is a way in the region, because these institutions are so understaffed, underfunded, what if they formed relationships with these kinds of informal entities to enhance their relationship to audiences and public, not to be and that hasn't really quite happened across the board, Sorry, yeah.
Yes, actually, it makes me think, Christopher, and some of you may have noticed how, I'm sorry, yes, how PS1 was part of organizing a Papocolo show in Puerto Rico, how the DIA curates Alora and Calzadilla site-specific installation in Puerto Rico. So it's interesting to see, and I haven't really looked into it, but there's clearly new politics of outsourcing, or maybe to use the term that I was using yesterday, of kind of renaturalizing some of our artistic and curatorial practices from once they came. So it's not about Papakolo having a show at PS1. It's about Klaus Bissenbach traveling to Puerto Rico to provide curatorial attention to his work. Now, I see a smile, or the burst of a
Yes,
smile.
the new Detroit, yeah.
I'm just mentioning that this is an interesting, I don't know if we can call it a trend yet, but this is just happening in terms of, the shared resources between institutions and local contexts of knowledge, and how the institutions are coming to us as opposed to bringing us there. Just mentioning this.
Yeah, well, I mean, think of it. Why have organizations like CCA7, Alice Yard, Fresh Milk, NLS, Pop-Up, Tembe, why do they exist? Before that, you had other kinds of mechanisms. If you look at the late 90s in the Anglophone Caribbean, in the late 90s, Smolax was founded. ICA Southern Caribbean. I'm not, I think Annalie had RA. All of us in different parts of the region, I remember like as early as 1991, this is before internet, before anything, right? I got booked, I was working for the TNT Review, and I tried to set up a system where I could get articles from Annalie, articles from Charles Campbell in Jamaica, and trying to find people to translate things from Venezuela and so on. But try to imagine how to do that then, faxing and it was awful because, and in fact, it got to a point where there was a negative association with people like Annalie and so on. They used to call them the fax brigade, right? But that's true. We were all just sending fax all over the place and trying to edit things, And then came the internet. And it's interesting. The internet arrived exactly at that moment when, because a lot of things like Smolax and things like that were done by internet, because nobody was in the same location. And so it became the perfect vehicle for the way we are spread out, to kind of embark on these enterprises. So then that's when the split came that I think you're kind of trying to tease out between institutions which are grounded in one location and people that are on the move, And I think that's kind of the interesting thing about the Caribbean. People are moving. It's mobile objects that disappear and reappear, and mobile people do it almost the same
No, we are
thing.
nomadic by nature. We are nomadic by nature.
We were stolen from the beginning, so stolen or tricked, so we have to keep moving,
How do you say that? Trinidadian? Trinidadians. Okay.
Watch what you say.
No.
Those are fighting words.
You know that we have said a lot here. We have talked a lot about negotiation. But I think it's also important to be, where do you stand in that negotiation? It's not everything we need to negotiate right now, but we have to be clear, where are we standing? And we are talking about the responsibility of the curator, but we also have to share the quota of the responsibility with something else. There's something called authorship, but there should be something called spectatorship or readership. It's like there's another quota of responsibility in whoever is reading us or looking at us, and it's our duty to insert our principles in the curatorial narratives, but there's also another quota of responsibility in the institutions, in the spectators, that we need to address too, because if not, we are giving a lot of power to the curator as a constructor of narratives. So I think we have to start thinking also about who do we curate for, and how the message also it's perceived, is read. And recently in Dominican Republic, I was telling Gabi and Thiago the other day about the singularity of Dominican language, because it's not Spanish, and how we have, yeah, it's a beautiful language. And how we have used some words like cursing, like a very bad word is future, perception is a very bad word, and West. And those three words are like the worst words in Dominican language for many of the reasons, for many reasons. But the perception part is something that is very heavy, very strong, because perception is not the way you look at something, it's the fiction that you construct by looking at something. So as the future is a fiction, the West is a fiction, and perception is a fiction. No, Pablo was telling me here that everything is a fiction. So it's very important to think about perception and who do we curate for, if anybody. Do we? Who do you curate for, Tanya? And then started moving it in here. I'm sorry.
Tanya's gone.
Who do you curate?
Who do I curate for? I curate. I don't know if I for myself, for the visitors to the museum. I'm very conscious of this issue of responsibility, though, and I think if you work within an institution, you have a huge responsibility. And my feeling very much, joining the Tate in the late 1990s, I was shocked at the monoculturalism of the Tate and its understanding of what constituted a history of modernism. And it was not something that related to my experience. And I always felt somehow very awkward in that situation, but that was a very necessary place for me to be, precisely because of I represented a different generation that had absorbed, different influences, and particularly because my formation had been in this moment of the late 80s, early 90s, where there was so much of this incredible writing and discourse going on, but that the previous generation that had been in charge of the institution had not absorbed or not paid attention to, and it had been, and it is still a process that's happening now with institutions like the Tate. And I think things like the MoMA's trips to Puerto Rico are part of, that changing generations within the institution. I think there's been a generational change within MoMA. Some really key people joining there that mean that institution is now thinking radically different from before, and it is also something that's happened within the Tate over the last 2 decades. But it's an ongoing process, and I have always felt that that's a very important, I've spent nearly 19 years at the Tate. It was a really important reason for me to be there, was to try and push that monolithic thing in a new direction in the small ways that I could. So that issue of responsibility, curatorial responsibility, personal responsibility was absolutely key. But always aware that, you can always do more. There's always something else. There's always someone that you've missed. There's always work that could have, you've always, and that's also the responsibility of curating it's a series of choices based on a limited set of resources. Even within an institution like the Tate, you have finite resources. You have to make the choices, but that's curating.
And I do think that's something we do well in the region, is with very limited resources in many cases, create some incredible experiments and projects out of that. I am conscious we're out of time. We have so many more things I wanted to talk about, from frameworks and logistics, and I certainly think something that has really run through many of the conversations we've had is this multidisciplinary approach to curating, which I think is a really interesting conversation to take on. With Alice Yard, we've seen an example of that. We've heard about it from your program as well, and certainly I think that can lead into some exciting models going forward. I do want to take a couple of questions, because I know if we can keep them short, and of course we can continue through lunch, but just to share with the floor, I know Elvis has had his hand up. Who's got the microphone? Perfect. Not me, the other one. Matt, behind you. Elvis and Shani. Okay.
Aman. I wanted to make just a statement to you, Sarah, and Annalie, as organizer of the exhibition, Lipstick and Marks, that as an artist at that moment, that it was a women's show. You forgot to say that. And then that was very important, because you didn't invite me, and I was very frustrated by not going. I mean, that's a discrimination toward the artists all the time happening, and curators forget that all the time. The artist first. Thank you.
We can never forget.
And Shani. Caitlin, if you can share that with Shani.
Okay, so I enjoyed the panel. So my question is for Tanya. So I didn't see the exhibit, and I'm coming from it from a historian of the diaspora in terms of very structural archival engagement. And so I know that you used Gilroy as kind of establishing the narrative to link all of these works, but in 2010, Gilroy was no longer controversial, and the field had moved, at least for historians and persons writing on, in terms of our engagement with the diaspora and the diaspora on its own terms, in terms of how they define themselves and so on and so forth, that the discussion had moved very long past that. Even in his own descriptions of the slave ship, new historical research is kind of, especially the text, The Slave Ship, that won awards, that came out in 2007, about the schools of sharks that followed ships along the transatlantic, which then reformulates our understanding of the slave ship, not just as a vehicle, but as a space in which identities are demolished and recreated, and so on and so forth. And so I'm really kind of trying to figure out, or try to understand, that kind of grounding in 2010 as somebody who has seen how the scholarship has kind of evolved over time. It may be that if I had seen the exhibition, I may have a different understanding of it, but I didn't really have I was a little confused and a little thrown off, so I don't know if you could.
Well, it was really the idea behind the show was to try and grapple with the legacies of that book, and it was. I mean, the later sections of the show dealt with things like the conceptualizing of recent contemporary practice that Thelma Golden and Glenn Ligon had come up with in terms of this idea of post-blackness, which is also complex and controversial. But I felt that there were still things to be dealt with in Gilroy's book, and particularly in relation to narratives of visual modernism. And it was, I guess, the other subtext for this show was that I had done this show in 2007 with Ellen Gallagher around this idea of it was called Coral Cities, and it was a body of work which was around the idea of the Middle Passage and this kind of creative reconstruction of histories. So it was engaging with her very much, and that was a show that was staged at Tate Liverpool at a very particular moment in time, which was 2007, the 200-year anniversary of the abolition of slavery. the Tate wanted to do something at that moment, and it was felt that it was necessary to do something at Tate Liverpool. It was really something that was being requested also by the DCMS, the Departure of Culture, Media and Sport, that this should be marked by the national institutions. And my feeling was, well, let's not do something that is purely responding to this, but to do a show that we want to do by an artist who's really complex and interesting. So it was really coming out of my conversations with Ellen, and also looking back to that moment, talking with her about the importance of that moment in time of British cultural studies. So it was deliberately returning to a moment that, yes, maybe it had been passed by recent scholarship, but that there'd been a lot of unanswered questions and unresolved issues, and particularly around the legacies of that book, and Paul Gilroy's position within the kind of cultural landscape of the UK and the visual arts landscape of the UK. He had also been invited as an external curator to do a show at Tate Britain that also ended up being like a hugely complicated and controversial event called Picturing Blackness. And when I spoke to Paul about doing the show at Tate Liverpool, he was very supportive, but wanted to maintain a certain distance because of the experiences that he had had in terms of his work and its reception in the context of conversations around visual arts in the UK. So in a way, I was dealing very much with a kind of very local context, and the legacies of that, and the lack of resolution of those legacies, that I felt that it was worthwhile to go back to that particular text, which is a text that is, it had the same sort of resonance as something like Edward Said's Orientalism. It had that kind of like extra, but it acquired all this, baggage as well with it. But I guess this also goes to the idea of the responsibility of the curators. I always find that complexity and that problematic something that requires looking at, rather than leaving in, we've moved on from there. Let's go back and actually have another look at this. That was, and as someone who I think of myself both as a curator and a historian, to go back again is also, to re-examine was also important to me. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Well, you can give the context.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tanya. And just in closing, I think going back to this idea of historical versus contemporary models, we've looked at a lot of curatorial practices from different angles today. I think coming back and putting those into practical contexts of institutional curating, looking at pop-up spaces, Alex Yard, Fresh Milk, and how those potential collaborations can really help create usable and workable models for the region going forward. So do continue talking about that over lunch. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panel, Chris Cozier, Tanya Barson, and Sarah Herman. It's been a pleasure talking to you.